Okay, everybody, thank you so much for coming to the 2 o'clock panel, which is entitled Policy in the Biosciences. Our three speakers for the day are Justin Biddle, who will be going first. The title of his paper, Genetically Modified Foods and the Ethics of Global Climate Change. The second paper is by David Frank, Deductive Risk and Biodiversity. And then the third paper by Evan Moreno-Davis, entitled Social Risk Management in Neuroscience Research and Policy. Justin, you're going to be going first, and I think we've been trying to keep the presentations to about 20 minutes or so, and then to leave at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So Justin, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks. So there's been a pretty big discussion for a while now about the potential benefits of genetically modified foods for people in the developing world. Right? People have argued that we can use techniques of genetic engineering to, say, increase the nutritional content of food, to raise yields, etc., and that doing this will usher in kind of a second green revolution and have these immense benefits for the developing world. Everything that I say will be relevant to this question, but I'm also interested in a new wrinkle in this discussion, which is the argument that GM foods can help us adapt to climate change. Right? So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to spend a couple minutes at the beginning talking about the connections between climate change, food prices, and political stability. And in particular, the idea that global climate change is helping to drive up food prices, which in turn is contributing to political instability in developing countries. And then talk about this one strategy for trying to combat this, and in particular this strategy, a strategy for severing the link between global climate change and increasing food prices. And this is genetically modified foods, right? The idea is to genetically modified foods so that they will, say, be increasingly resistant to droughts or increased salinity or something like this, right? And then this is also, I should say, a strategy that's sort of received recent attention by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in their recent 2012 annual letter. They've highlighted this as being one of their important funding strategies going forward. Right? And then I'll take a few minutes at the end to evaluate this strategy. I'm not going to be able to say anything very definitive given the time constraints, and this is research that I'm just starting, so I'm not sure I have anything really definitive to say, but I do want to lay out at least some of the conditions that would need to be met if this strategy were to be an effective one. And in particular, I want to focus on conditions related to patenting and licensing. Okay, so here's a chart of food prices from about 1960 to 2010 or so. As you can see, they reached a peak around 1970 with the oil crisis and reached their low point around 2000. But since 2000, they've been going up pretty steadily. There's been a lot of attention paid to this, right? And there's a bunch of reasons for this. One of them is simply rising oil prices. Given that we have an industrial food system, the more the oil costs, the more food is going to cost. Another driver is ethanol production. We're taking more of our corn and making ethanol and putting that into our gas tanks. That's also increasing food prices. But according to many, an increasingly important driver is global climate change. This is a quotation from this recent Gates Foundation letter that I mentioned a second ago. The threat of climate change is becoming clearer. Preliminary studies show that the rise in global temperature alone could reduce the productivity of the main crops by over 25%. Climate change will also increase the number of droughts and floods that can wipe out an entire season of crops. More and more people are raising familiar alarms about whether the world will be able to support itself in the future as the population heads toward a projected 9.3 billion by 2050. So pretty heady stuff. Heady stuff for anyone, but especially people in developing countries. Right? Here's a chart of the percentage of income that the average household spends on food. I don't know if you can read this. Here in the US, the average household spends 6% of its income on food, UK 9%, but as we get into developing countries, Brazil, India, Kenya, we see percentages like 25%, 35%, and 45%, right? So if we really run into significant food shortages, which significantly raise the price of food, that's going to present major problems for people who spend such a high percentage of their income on food, right? And not surprisingly, a lot of people have linked this to political instability. This is just one study that does this from an IMF working group. There's a whole bunch of studies that conclude the same thing. They write, in low-income countries, increases in the international food prices lead to a significant deterioration of democratic institutions and a significant increase in the incidence of anti-government demonstrations rights and civil conflict. So something here needs to be done, right? Well, what to do about this, and particularly what to do about the part that global climate change is causing. Right? I'm sure you all know this, but there are sort of two general big strategies for dealing with climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is the attempt to eliminate the causes of global climate change, so doing things like reducing carbon emissions. And adaptation is a very different one. This is dealing not with the causes of climate change, but with the effects of them, and trying to develop strategies of dealing more effectively with the effects of global climate change. And this is where this GM strategy fits in. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but the hope is to be able to genetically engineer crops that will be able to survive flooding or droughts or any kind of effects of global climate change that we can imagine, which will make us better able to deal with the effects of climate change. Okay, so is this a good strategy? Well, there are several conditions that need to be met here in order for the strategy to work. And the first set of conditions are technical conditions. Obviously, if the strategy is going to work, we need to be able to develop GM crops that are both safe and effective in achieving desired aims. It's not at all obvious that we'll be able to do this. I've seen a lot more literature touting the potential effects of GM crops to be able to do this than I've seen real evidence that they will actually be able to do this. Right? But okay, so this is one technical condition, and another technical condition is that we have to do this quickly. When it comes to global climate change, at least time isn't on our side, and so we need to be able to do this relatively quickly. All right. It's somewhat surprising to me that I've read a fair amount of the literature on, well, generally the potential benefits of GM crops for the developing world, and a lot of people end their discussion at these technical conditions, right? And they sort of assume that these technical conditions will be able to be met, and then conclude that therefore we ought to pursue this strategy. I'm not making any mind-blowing point here, but these technical conditions are not sufficient for pursuing this strategy. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. There are other conditions that need to be met, what one might call conditions of justice. We would need to develop GM crops not only work, not only do the things technically that they're supposed to do, but that also can be distributed widely in a cost-effective manner. Right? We don't need to look very far to see many cases where we have the technical ability to do something and yet we don't do it. So look at pharmaceutical research where we have the technical know-how to wipe a number of diseases off the face of the planet, and yet we don't do it for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is because of the property rights that companies have over these drugs. Right? They don't want to put in the research needed to produce these drugs, or they simply don't have any economic incentive to distribute them. Right? So these conditions of justice need to be met. And this is especially important in this, I think, climate change case, given that the developing countries that we're speaking of aren't the ones that are causing climate change, right? We are. So, is it likely that these conditions will be met in the future? In talking about this, I want to bring up one case, the golden rice case, because this is an example of a genetically modified food that is widely touted as meeting these conditions of justice. Right? So we need to talk about this one case and see if it's potentially replicable. Most of you probably know what this is, but this was rice that was genetically modified to produce beta-carotene, which is necessary for vitamin A production. So there were obviously a lot of people in developing countries have rice as a staple food, and many of them were vitamin A deficient. This led to widespread blindness, in many cases death, and Ingo Patricus and a couple of other people genetically modified rice to contain beta-carotene, and the thought was that this could be really, really beneficial. It turns out that it was reasonably beneficial, I think, not nearly so beneficial as the original headline said. Right? There's no way this is going to save 1 million kids a year. You'd have to eat something like 20 pounds of cooked rice a day in order to get the benefits that they originally thought you would get, but we'll let that slide. But this was a case where a crop was genetically modified and distributed at a price that people in developing countries could afford. So what had to happen in order for this to be the case? Well, you don't need to read this. This is a list of all of the patents that went into the production of golden rice, and this is a list of all of the patent holders. Right? So we have about 31 patent holders and about 75 different patents that were all necessary for the production of golden rice. Here on this next slide, these are not patents, this is not intellectual property, but this is real tangible property. Something like 16 or more different entities holding these bits of tangible property here. Right? I'm more concerned about the intellectual property case. But what had to happen? Well, none of these entities gave up their property rights, but what they did do was allow for royalty-free licensing. Now, why did they do that in this case? I think one of the main reasons why they did this in this case was around the year 2000. Genetically modified crops were even more controversial then than they are now, especially in Europe. And they needed this was a real PR feather in their cap to be able to say, look, we're not just making money for Monsanto, we're genetically engineering these crops which are helping to save blind children in the third world or whatever, right? And it would have been a PR disaster if they had, if they wouldn't have distributed this because one of these countries was refusing to license it freely or anything like that, right? So anyway, that's what needed to happen in order for this to be distributed at prices that they could afford. Is this likely to continue? Is it likely that in cases going forward, if we have crops that are genetically modified that are potentially beneficial, is it likely that all of these entities, and you can expect a similar number for any new genetically modified crop, is it likely that all of them will allow for royalty-free licenses? It seems to me that my original answer to this was no, it's not at all likely. And I still think it's fairly unlikely, although I'm actually becoming a little less pessimistic about that. But I'm not going to have time to talk about that now. I could talk about it in the discussion period. Right? 5 minutes. Okay. Well, actually, let me talk about that now. Is this likely? So I was originally thinking, okay, I don't see any big difference between the GM case and the pharma case, right? The pharma case, again, is this case where we have the technical ability to do something, and yet because of property rights over something, companies are unwilling to distribute it. And I think that there's an important difference between the GM case and the pharma case, and the difference pertains to the way in which patents operate in these two areas. So when it comes to pharmaceuticals, there are patented entities that are required for the development of a pharmaceutical, but they aren't in the pharmaceutical itself, right? These are patents on genes and things like this that are used to screen chemical compounds to see if they're effective at, bonding to whatever. But the patented genes in this question are not actually in the pharmaceutical, right? And the result is that when you buy a drug, you really buy the drug and you can do whatever you want to with it, right? So this leads to the problem that pharmaceutical companies are worried about people buying a whole bunch of drugs at low costs in developing countries and then shipping them over and selling them on the black market in developed countries, right? That actually, there's some recourse that that an owner of a GM crop would have in this case that a pharmaceutical company wouldn't have. Because in GM crops, the patented genes are actually in the seeds, right? And the result of that is that when you quote unquote buy a seed, you don't really buy it. What you do is you purchase a license to use it, right? So it's possible for, say, companies to allow for royalty-free licenses in developing countries, right? If somebody took the seeds to the developing world, you could give them to someone else or sell them to someone else, but that someone else would not have a license to use it. And there would be legal recourse. Monsanto or the companies in question would have some potential legal recourse in that situation that a pharmaceutical company would not have, right? Now, I'm not saying that this makes the situation okay and that this is therefore a good strategy, right? What I'm saying is that this is at least a potential, that this is one difference between the pharma case and the GM case, which makes things perhaps a little bit better. This is actually, well, surprisingly, this is a case where stronger IP rights could actually be beneficial for people in developing countries, right? Okay. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Okay, our next presenter is David Frank.
Can everyone hear me? Thanks for having me. My talk's about what I'm going to call deductive risk, but the only reason I called it deductive risk will come out in a minute, and I'm happy to change the name. But the big idea here is just that values have particularly interesting roles in conceptual engineering and operationalization for measurement in applied policy relevant science. And I'll call this deductive risk, and I'll say that these arise in conservation biology because biodiversity has become this goal, and there are many, many, many ways to define it. And so this raises this problem about whether your definition is sort of capturing what you wanted to, or whether you risk leaving something out that you cared about. And then finally, I'm going to make an argument that perhaps the focus on biological diversity as a goal for policy is actually kind of questionable. So this is the outline. I'll try to distinguish what's been called inductive risk in the literature with deductive risk in applied science, and then talk about these multiple definitions of biodiversity and measures of biological diversity, and show that this raises the problem of deductive risk in applied contexts. And then I'll suggest that maybe what we should really be interested in, and maybe what we were interested in all along, is maybe species composition as opposed to species diversity. Okay, so the argument from inductive risk goes back, I think, a really long time, maybe to Aristotle, but in the 20th century it was kind of forcefully put by Rudner and then recently revived by Heather Douglas. And it's this argument that goes like this: look, acceptance of uncertain scientific hypotheses have non-epistemic consequences, and so the sort of weightiness or importance of those non-epistemic consequences can affect what you take to be sort of sufficient evidence for that claim. So take, I think Rudner's example was, you're looking at a drug and you're trying to decide whether it's toxic, versus looking at, belt buckles being defective. So if you're looking at this from sort of classical hypothesis testing, you have to trade off risks of type 1 and type 2 error in setting your alpha level or your significance level, right? If you're doing Bayesian statistics, it seems like you're going to be trading off some risks in setting your priors. So, you might people talk about sort of conservative priors, or saying that, sort of maximizing your uncertainty in your priors. When should you do that versus kind of letting in some sort of expert judgment to set your priors? A more sort of direct application of the Rudner argument would be to say that, at what credence level do you know or practically accept the hypothesis? I think that argument was kind of discredited by Richard Jeffrey, but I still think that it certainly holds for these other cases. But I want to distinguish that from deductive risk and say that these it's a different case when you're looking at applied scientific definitions, whether sort of operational or conceptual, and these definitions have non-epistemic consequences. So you could think about this sort of as consequences of conventionalism. So when you have a scientific term in applied science that, there are various ways you could define it, it's kind of a convention, how we do it, those conventions will have non-epistemic consequences, right? So think about definitions of health and disease. Poverty is a really good case. So say you're an economist and you're charged with coming up with some definition of poverty that is not only going to be used to track the distribution of poor people over space and time, but also maybe to institute some sort of cash transfer program from the very wealthy to the very poor. Pretty much all measures of risk, obviously, have this problem. And I'm going to say that defining biodiversity for policy-relevant conservation biology carries risk. So what is biodiversity? Well, it's a portmanteau of biological diversity. It was coined in the 80s by a bunch of scientists who were very, very worried about species loss. And so it was introduced in this very explicitly political context. It was actually a national forum in D.C. And it has sort of become a policy goal of pretty much everyone who is interested in biological conservation. So if you ask any of the major NGOs, you ask governments who've signed the international treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, they'll say, yeah, we want to conserve biological diversity, sort of per se, right? It's also sort of become an academic growth industry. This is a number of publications that include biodiversity in the abstract from, I think, 88 to 2001. Okay, so this was a paper in 1996, about 10 years after this term was coined. This guy, Don DeLong, who I think worked for Fish and Wildlife Service and maybe still does, he looked at something like 80 or 90 papers that had definitions of biodiversity, and he tried to create a definition that would sort of capture everything that people were talking about. So this is what he came up with. Biodiversity is a state or attribute of a site or area and specifically refers to the variety within and among living organisms, assemblages of living organisms, biotic communities, and biotic processes, whether naturally occurring or modified by humans. It can be measured in terms of genetic diversity, the identity and number of different types of species, assemblages of species, biotic communities, biotic processes, and the amount, for example, abundance, biomass, cover, rate, and structure of each. It can be observed and measured at any spatial scale, ranging from microsites and habitat patches to the entire biosphere. Okay, so here's a thought experiment that maybe will lead you to think that we shouldn't have reified this by sort of combining it into a single word. Imagine these two descriptive studies. I'm sure I could have found studies, but it's easier just to do a thought experiment. So one study looks at heterogeneity at a particular locus amongst a population of humans, right? Another study looks at heterogeneity of species composition between habitat patches in a tropical forest. Okay, so are these studies describing the same thing, or sort of aspects of the same thing, namely biodiversity, whatever that is? Well, according to this definition, yes, right? Okay. So when it comes to sort of using this science in policy, what happens is people will choose sort of their favorite taxa or populations that are specific, important to people, various, assemblages or processes that you care about. You choose some sort of biogeographic scale and maybe a measure of heterogeneity, and you collect data on this and you use it to sort of prioritize places for conservation management. So I have a picture of a butterfly. It's a taxon that's very, very well studied. There's lots of lepidopterists out there, lots of amateur lepidopterists actually, who have developed an enormous amount of data. So if you were gonna sort of try to define and measure biological diversity, these are the kinds of choices you would have to make. So in terms of scales or like the units that you care about, anything from alleles or particular genes to genotypes, various aspects of the phenotype, populations, you could look at species or higher taxa, communities, assemblages, ecosystems, or ecological processes. And then there's all sorts of measures of heterogeneity that you could use. So richness is sort of the number of types that are in an area. So species richness is a very commonly used measure of biodiversity of an area. Evenness is sort of the relative abundance of the different types. So you might say that an area, take two areas, they have the same species richness, but in one species completely dominates. So that's like maybe less biodiverse than the one where they're more evenly distributed. You could look at compositional difference between areas. Complementarity is often used in the planning literature. It just means the sort of new species added when you add an area, how many new species relative to some set that's already created. Rarity is often really important for people, or endemism. So especially in the US with the Endangered Species Act, we think that to conserve biodiversity is often sort of conflated with conserving species that are threatened or going to go extinct. And then there's all sorts of measures of disparity or difference that you could choose. Morphological, phylogenetic, developmental, the list goes on and on. Any biological property you can pick, there's going to be some measure of difference that you could come up with. And so, yeah, so I think that's enough sort of pluralism. But there's more, actually. We could go on, because for each of these measures, right, there are various mathematical operationalizations that you could have of each one. So I think that this sort of convincingly shows, if you didn't think this already, that there's no kind of overall biodiversity, right? There's only kind of biological diversities as specified or operationalized for a particular purpose, right? Okay. So the issue is that whatever underlying justification for conserving kind of biological variety or natural variety that we accept focus on a particular property, for example, species richness, which is often used in this context, may leave out other properties that we care about. So here's just some empirical evidence. So apparently in Indo-Pacific coral reefs, there's non-concordance between species richness and endemism for fish and coral species. So if you just cared about richness, you might prioritize the wrong reefs if you also cared about endemism. This is, on the right, this is the data set from this Miege paper from 2003, where he looked at richness and morphological disparity amongst old world cuttlefish and found that there's no clean relationship between those two. Okay, so this last thing should lead you to believe, right, that Deductive risk is going to arise if you choose one particular measure because it might not be correlated with something else you care about. But you could also think, well, we can sort of combine these into some sort of index, right? But then, of course, you're going to be trading off what you care about in that index, and so values are going to come into play as well. So I just want to close with this kind of quick argument that, you know, maybe this whole focus on biodiversity was a bad idea to begin with. So should we conserve biodiversity anyway? So arguably, species composition, so the particular species that exists in a locality, not species diversity per se, is what should matter to conservationists and ecosystem managers who are interested in various projects. So you want to maintain ecosystem services, food, fiber, fuel, pollination services, medicine. If I'm interested in maintaining, you know, pollination services, I care about the particular species and their properties, right? I don't care about, you know, some abstract measure of diversity in a particular taxa. I might, but it would be for a particular purpose. 5 minutes, thanks. We also want to conserve, you know, threatened and charismatic species. People still care about the panda, you know, even though they won't reproduce to save their own species, because, you know, because we find them beautiful, and you know, maybe if the panda went extinct in a particular area, right, diversity would actually increase. Maybe it would. We also, of course, want to thwart the spread of disease organisms and, you know, other organisms that we don't like, right? So, and any just measure of diversity is not going to capture that because this depends on the particular properties of the species present, right? So I have this kind of anthropocentric thought experiment. So imagine we had this aggregate utility function, right, that takes species and returns that species' overall utility to humans. And I say overall utility because it's not just money, right? We care about beauty, and we care about things that are scientifically interesting, and, you know, people's cultural heritage, sort of cultural, biological heritage, and so on. These utilities will depend, obviously, right, on the properties of the particular species. So are they vectors for disease? Do they perform useful services like pollination, right? Do we find them beautiful or scientifically interesting? And it seems very possible, indeed plausible in a lot of cases that we can think of, that a landscape with higher total biological utility will have less diversity, right? Okay, so I have a concluding question, which I haven't answered this yet. I think it's really complicated and actually goes back to some conversations that the other talks started, which is, you know, should we conserve this term, right, this concept, biodiversity? So I could see lots of arguments for no. So it's too vague, it's too imprecise. You know, call things what they are, right? Don't say biodiversity when you mean species richness. Say species richness, right? It's also arguably has had limited success as a theoretical term in the life sciences, although that gets into all sorts of complicated issues. You know, the thing is, people have been using this term now for a while to sort of brand conservation, and maybe it has some positive connotations, and maybe its imprecision is sort of a feature, not a bug, so it maybe has heuristic value. Certainly, heterogeneity is kind of a central explanandum in the life sciences, so Darwin was interested in sort of explaining the diversity of life. So I think there are sort of arguments on both sides, but I'd be happy to hear opinions about this particular question during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our third presenter is Evan Moreno-Davis.
The rapid pace of research in neuroscience has led to projects that will soon raise, and in many cases have already raised, a number of vitally important questions about the various risks associated with such research. Philip Kitcher, in his 2001 Science, Truth, and Democracy, proposed methods of anticipating, among other things, the possible negative consequences of scientific research, and for fairly democratically determining which projects should be encouraged or discouraged on account of their consequences. He subsequently refined and supplemented these ideas in his 2001 Science in a Democratic Society. In this paper, I will consider 4 particular social risks posed by neuroscience research. I will use these as test cases to evaluate Kitcher's account, and will conclude that his general prescriptions are appropriate for particular kinds of risk, but that there are others where they importantly fail. So first, I'll provide an overview of each of the risks, and subsequently we'll get into some of the details of Kitcher's position. Risk 1 is unequal access to neuroenhancement technologies. Cosmetic psychopharmacology in particular has become a fairly hot topic in recent years. Aside from drugs that promise to alter one's mood or personality, there has also been particular interest in cognitive enhancement. So far, this has mainly been limited to the use of stimulants such as Ritalin or Adderall, the benefits of which are relatively modest considering the possibilities. But as these drugs and other technologies for improving cognitive performance continue to advance, a number of adverse consequences for society may result. If such technologies are inexpensive and plentiful, there might be tremendous pressure to use them, whether or not one wants to, simply to remain competitive in the job market. If they are scarce, however, there is danger of a precipitous increase in social inequality, as only those who are able to afford enhancement may be eligible for many of the best-paying jobs. Risk 2, violation of privacy due to neuroimaging technology. In the last couple years, researchers at Stanford and UCLA have reported that they can use fMRI to associate particular concrete thoughts with identifiable patterns of neural activity. Even if the technology falls short of mind reading, the possibility that people may someday have the means of observing activity in our brains without our consent, perhaps even without our knowledge, is a cause for concern. Risk 3 is stigmatization associated with the characterization of atypical neural traits. To take just one example, there's been a great deal of interest in the last 10 years or so in the gene for monoamine oxidase A, dysfunction of which has been linked to aggressive and antisocial behavior. Given that victims of child abuse who possess the low MAOA allele are particularly likely to become violent as adults, men with that history and genetic predisposition offered it as grounds for a diminished responsibility defense in 2009. Though he was sentenced to 32 years, he did avoid a first-degree murder conviction. So on the one hand, identifying such traits is good news. On the other, we can imagine people being quite wary of those who possess them, even those who had not been abused as children. More worrying still is the fact that the frequency of this gene differs between ethnic groups, and so knowledge of such traits may perpetuate existing prejudices or create new ones. The fourth and last risk is fairly nebulous, but one hears it a lot. The central idea is that human well-being fundamentally depends on a certain conception of ourselves as agents, and that a distant future neuroscience, by identifying the biological, biochemical, and environmental causes of our thoughts and behavior, threatens to erode our sense of agency, and with it our humanity. This might seem like little more than reactionism rooted in some sort of dualistic conception of the self, but to the extent that such a conception seems to be fairly widespread and neuroscience potentially threatens to overturn it, we may, at the very least, expect a realignment of many people's values to follow certain radical discoveries, or the cumulative effect of smaller discoveries. And it's hard to anticipate in advance what, as it were, the new agential paradigm would look like, whether it'll be better or worse than the old one, or, for that matter, what sort of transitional stages we might go through on the way there. So, yeah, these are some risks. Now, how does Kitcher propose to address all of these? His two books on the topic are very ambitious, and he has a number of different targets in them, but the important part for our purposes is that in arguing for the interconnectedness of science and democratic values, he presupposes that science should become, in his words, well-ordered. This involves, among other things, better educating the public about what scientists do, but also bringing them further into the decision-making process. Research programs, Kitcher notes, must cohere with various epistemic and other much broader values. In this latter regard, his 2011 account of well-ordered science is very different from his 2001, in that scientific significance, as he describes it, itself depends on certain public value judgments, which are formed in a process of ideal deliberation, which is Kitcher's proxy for democratic processes. Though he attempts to allay concerns from proponents of the autonomy of science, he does acknowledge that, quote, "It is possible that ideal conversation aimed at balancing the claims of private projects and the public good might impose more general obligations on people than those of which we are currently aware," end quote. He notes that this applies both to scientists and to citizens generally, but obviously for this crowd I'll be talking about scientists, and in particular I want to take up the suggestion, which he more explicitly treats in the 2001 book, that a lot of projects, perhaps including the ones I've just described, might be off limits entirely. Although Kitcher's project certainly represents a valuable contribution in many ways, one challenge in evaluating it is that it is heavily dependent on idealizations. He admits, for example, that science is unlikely to ever be well-ordered in the ways that he describes. For this reason, it's often difficult to figure out how best to approximate these ideals in practice, or what sort of decisions might be made in an appropriately constituted system. He does offer a few concrete examples in Chapter 9 of his 2001. He discusses climate change, GMOs, the origins of life, and biomedical technology. And some of what he says about the last of these might provide insight into how to approach our first risk, or set of risks, namely those associated with neuroenhancement. In discussing mammalian cloning and other reproductive technologies, for example, he thinks that well-ordered science would frown on many applications thereof, for various reasons, not the least of which is that he believes that, quote him again, well-ordered biomedical practice would be far more convinced with the medical needs of the many people whose lives are warped or truncated by diseases that do not afflict the affluent, and it would be correspondingly intolerant of research that responds to minor discomforts of the rich, including lines of investigation that enhance the opportunities for assisted reproduction, end quote. From this, we may speculate that the people whose deliberations constitute well-ordered science would likewise permit neuroenhancement only insofar as it could be shown to be consistent with certain egalitarian ideals. I'll say more about this strategy later, but for now, I want to take a step backwards and say that the core claim I'll be making in this paper is that there's an important distinction to be made between two kinds of risk. One of these is represented by enhancement and, as I'll discuss shortly, the imaging privacy. And I argue that these are more easily forestalled than the other kind of risk, represented by stigma and agency. This latter kind of risk requires radical intervention to stay clear of it. Moreover, and here I disagree with Kitcher, I argue that this kind of risk is relatively rare and that, except in extreme and local cases, the harms of limiting research will tend to outweigh the benefits. As an aside, I should point out that there's a wide range of possible policies, of course. Kitcher does talk about, for example, promoting certain research priorities over others given limited funds, but he does also think that some should be ruled out entirely. And that aspect of the position is what I'll here be taking issue with. So, returning then to the example of neuroimaging and privacy, it might be useful to briefly consider Robert Blank's tripartite analysis of the policy dimensions of neuroscience research. The first dimension pertains to decisions regarding research and development. The second to individual use of available technologies. And the third to the aggregate consequences of widespread application of these technologies. With this distinction in mind, it's clear that there are many ways of presenting possible harms from neuroimaging technologies, and in particular, there are various stages at which policy interventions may occur. For example, as the research is being performed, as the technology becomes commercially available, and even afterwards. As certain problems begin to become apparent, we can jump in and put a stop to them. In that way, there is an important contrast with the remaining two risks, that is, with the stigma and the threats to agency. There are few points at which one can intervene, and these are relatively early in the process. These last two cases differ from each other in that there are probably fewer steps in the stigma case. Basically, you identify a trait, it gets stigmatized, and that's it. Whereas, as I suggested earlier, the loss of agency is likely to be a more gradual process resulting from many discoveries over time. Even so, it can be very difficult to anticipate in advance of a given result that now is the time to intervene. Okay, thanks. Kitcher is generally optimistic about the amount of information that his deliberators will have to base their decisions on, and about their ability to predict the possible consequences of research, but his arguments for this are fairly perfunctory. And importantly, in the absence of complete information, we may expect that even ideal deliberators will be cautious and loss-averse with respect to certain possible outcomes, and we may expect them to reject certain paths that ultimately would have been to their benefit. That said, we can all agree that certain scientific enterprises are clearly harmful and shouldn't be allowed, even solely on the basis of their expected disutility way down the line. But in general, I do want to advocate the Millian approach that Kitcher rejects in his earlier book. There are various technical objections to be raised to Kitcher's anti-Millian arguments, which would take too long to get into. But the most important, I think, is that we have a commitment to truth and scientific discovery in general, if not to particular truths. Thus, attempting to appraise individual discoveries in terms of their suitability for public consumption would send a symbolic message that the only way for the sciences to be appropriately sensitive to values is by adopting this sort of mercenary attitude. Insofar as this would result in a cheapening of the ideals of research in the public eye, there are purely pragmatic reasons why we shouldn't be overly bold in deciding to roll out certain projects. That said, there is a danger that we should be mindful of, which is that some of the harms that result from discoveries might be irreversible. This is an important consideration and should figure prominently in the decision whether to include a given research program among that small class of projects I mentioned earlier, the ones that are obviously very dangerous. And I do believe that there are relatively few truly irreversible harms, in part because of the many contingent social factors that they depend upon. For example, when trying to prevent a stigma from attaching to MAOA mutations or something like them, one response is to deal with the environmental factors that might cause the aggressive behavior to be realized. So in summary, while risks abound in scientific research, many of these can be addressed late in the process. Therefore, moderate and restrained oversight over research itself is the best way to promote the broadly democratic ideals that form the backbone of Kitcher's account. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. Why don't the presenters come up and we can take questions from the audience. Who would like to start?
Well, thank you all three of you. These were three really fascinating talks. I have like 4 questions I could ask each of you. I think I'm just going to offer a comment to David, since I understand that you're leaving tonight. And I probably won't have a chance to chat with you about it. So in Douglas's inductive risk argument, she puts a lot of emphasis on the idea of risk, and a lot of the argument hinges on the possibility that we've gotten the wrong answer, right? That we think dioxin is safe and we're wrong, and so because of that, it's going to have policy implications. And actually, I know I pushed her on this, and Kevin has pushed her on this. Trying to get her to acknowledge, the possibility that, well, if we're worried about the harmful consequences, maybe we should also be interested in the beneficial consequences.
Yeah, sort of upside risk or something like that.
Yeah. And what strikes me about your deductive risk is that you're bringing in more of this positive role, right? If we have these purposes in mind, if this is why we care about biodiversity, then this gives us a positive argument for adopting a certain kind of definition.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And I mean, if you're doing decision analysis of the sort that I'm interested in, where we would be sort of coming up with these utility functions and so on, all the positive stuff is included in there too. So, but yeah, that's a good point. I think maybe in emphasizing risk, you don't take into account these other values.
Sort of following off on this as well, and in response to your request for comments about the possible reasons in favor of a vague definition, that's precisely why you want a vague definition, so that you can find room within the definition for the different values. You shouldn't presuppose, as you might by using a very specific definition, that there's only one thing you want.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a good way to put the upside of using the vague or imprecise term.
Questions?
Yeah, one of the last things from the last talk was I might have misheard. Were you saying there are very few truly irreversible harms?
Yeah. I mean,
so that's, okay. So if that's what you said. That's interesting, because my sort of immediate gut reaction was there are very few truly reversible harms. Insofar as what's, so there might be very few irreversible categories of harms. And so if we were to create a type of stigmatization, then we can also uncreate that hypothetically. So XYY, for example, was stigmatized for a period of time. That's faded quite a bit. But all of those XYY guys who in the 80s and 90s were treated like crap, that's not undoable. And so are you talking about the category, or are you talking about the harms themselves? Because I'm sort of, I tend to sort of focus on the individual people who were harmed, and you can't sort of unring that bell.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess cast in those terms, I was talking more about the categories than the harms themselves. I mean, irreversibility itself is sort of a funny concept that seems to admit of degrees, but yeah, the general idea is that there's some extent to which certain harms can be offset in certain ways.
Justin, we haven't gotten to ask you a question yet. So I was curious. It was really interesting seeing. I heard a little bit of the gold price, but realizing how many patents were actually involved in that. That was really striking. And I was curious, in terms of the patenting, do they need to get permission from all these folks in order to actually do the research that leads to, say, the golden rice or this kind of stuff? Or is it they can go ahead and do this research and then they need to get permission in order to actually sort of be, using this, giving it out to people? I had usually been thinking they needed permission to do the research, and that seems like it's an even bigger mess than if you can't even get started on it, but I wasn't totally sure. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you need permission to do the research. Yeah. So there was I think a lot of these patents were obtained in the course of doing the research for golden rice, but not all of them. But there was a case I don't remember, not too long ago, called Mady versus Duke, that essentially established that there's virtually no research exemption when it comes to patents. So I mean, if somebody has a patent on something and you do research on it that has anything to do with any commercial application, interpreted very, very broadly, there's no exemption, right? So
maybe kind of following up on that, I mean, realizing just the thicket of the patents and all, it's kind of amazing that these companies are able to sort of actually get anywhere, given the
Right.
Is there some sort of again, I just don't have a good sense of this. Is there some sort of kind of general sense of agreements among companies about actually being willing to actually let people have permission to do things? It's just kind of amazing to me that they can actually get anywhere given this network of
yeah, I mean, in some cases there are agreements, but I mean, I've done more research on this, on the sharing stuff in the biomedical field, but in the biomedical field there's widespread infringement, and yeah, and at some point maybe down the line, if somebody realizes that someone has infringed upon something that might actually be worthwhile or something, maybe then it will be litigated. But there's sort of an informal agreement that when it comes to more upstream stuff, just don't worry about it. Yeah.
Justin, I have a question for you. There's a practical political problem here in terms of just the cultural impediments to the deployment of GM crops. It's my understanding that Africa has been especially resistant to this particular innovation. So, over the time frame that we're looking at, which I suppose within the next 10 to 20 years, what do you see as the prospects for going forward for this kind of technology to be actually deployed?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I do know that they are starting to deploy some GM crops, and I mean, I don't know that. I'm sure that the cultural obstacles will differ from region to region and country to country there, and I honestly don't know enough about to say, what the prospects are in particular regions, but I'm sure that in some, that the obstacles would be so significant that that it would not be likely, you know, in the next couple of years. But that's an additional set of obstacles that I honestly haven't looked into too much, so I can't say too much about it.
And I do have one question for Evan. What are there any technologies, or are there any psychopharmacological innovations that are actually, that you view as actually, or potentially as actually benign, as beneficial?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you had to have like a particular type in mind, but yeah, on the whole, I'd say that most of them seem to be pretty beneficial.
I mean, I asked that question in the context of it's going to be extremely difficult to place restrictions on the national level on these kinds of interventions. I mean, people are going to go, if they can't get it here, they're going to go elsewhere. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to say about that.
So, I have a question. Was pointing to somebody else?
Oh.
Sorry.
No, you first.
Go ahead. I'll go next, but I've been waiting.
This is the
back of your head.
The inevitable vagueness of pointing.
Thank you. I actually just wanted, David, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your sense of how aware are biologists of their different usages of biodiversity. Is there any discussion in the literature around that this is creating a problem for them? I mean, it just strikes me because it's interesting. It comes out of a politic.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it feeds back into a politic.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. Pretty much every major review of biodiversity includes at least a sentence that talks about how it's unfortunate that the term is being used in so many different ways. I mean, like I cited some of the major textbooks, McGurran and Kevin Gaston's book in 1996, you know, talking, you know, in the introduction they'll usually say something about it, and you know they'll say things about how it's unfortunate for communication purposes because, you know, if you know you're using it one way and then you use the term and someone else thinks you're talking about something else, you could be talking past each other. But I was more interested in the cases where, you know, a government or say Conservation International who has a bunch of land that they want to be prioritized for conservation, you know, they're going to hire conservation biologists who are going to measure it in a particular way, right? And I don't think that there was also a recent book called What is Biodiversity that was published by, or was written by Kim Sterelny and James McLaurin, who are philosophers of biology, about this. And they more or less say, well, it's species richness supplemented by some data on, you know, morphology or something like that. I mean, it's really, it's unfortunate. I think that book is problematic in all sorts of ways, but they do have at least, they have a chapter where they talk about what they call sort of the measurement problem for conservation biology. But I think the problem is much deeper than they recognize, and they have these sort of like quick arguments about why species are the units we should be caring about, because they don't think that, you know, they think that there's like a good sort of well-defined species concept from cladistics that we can use, but the higher taxa, you know, there's no fact of the matter about the higher taxa, so, you know, we can't use those taxonomies. I mean, yeah, so, and insofar as that is going to have any impact on conservation biologists, I would doubt highly that it will. But we'll see. I mean, I'm not sure. So.
So the second, just a quick second part, is there any, in the discussions, you mentioned the sort of line in the paper saying we have, yes, there's a vagueness to the term. Is there much by way of talking, you mentioned the mathematical operations. So,
Yeah.
for example, in public health, there's a lot of discussion around whether you use absolute or relative risks. That's
Right.
something people seem really
Right.
comfortable talking about. Is that kind of debate? Or
It is, yeah, and a lot of the debate in terms of the mathematical operationalizations. I mean, there's been some philosophers of ecology who've done some work on this, but so there was this long debate from I think the 70s in ecology about whether diverse ecosystems are more stable, and as it turns out, a lot of it sort of depends on how you define diversity and how you define stability. And there are sort of many mathematical ways of doing that, and so yeah, that's a huge thing. And the textbooks that I just mentioned, you know, there's sort of like chapters that are reviews on, say, species richness, and you know they go through all the different, you know, statistical models, sampling problems, and so on. So yeah, I mean. Yes, but we can talk about it in more detail if you'd like. Yeah.
So Evan, I'm thinking about your sort of criticism of Kitcher on the million point, and it makes me think about a sort of more general question about the relationship between sort of ideal theory and non-ideal theory in this kind of discussion, right? So it seems to me consistent to say. This kind of research should not be done. Such and such kind of research should not be done as an ideal claim. And then also to say nothing should be done to restrict this kind of research as a non-ideal claim. So you know, we could still say that the ideal, the well-ordered science, would never include research of this kind, but that there are various complicated reasons about our society such that we could never do anything coercive to prevent that research from happening. So I had to like step it out at the end of the argument. So maybe you answer this question.
I didn't know. I think that definitely seems to be the underlying idea in Kitcher's first book. That is, you know, he thinks that you know, there are definitely some things that shouldn't be done. And if anything, he seems to think that scientists should just like recognize that and sort of step out. There really shouldn't be any sort of policy interventions. In the second book, he seems to have a much more intrusive sense of what sort of steps should be taken. But even then, and I guess this definitely seems to get at the heart of the ideal, non-ideal thing, because in some places he says, you know, that IRBs are actually pretty close to ideal, but then elsewhere he seems to think that that we do need, I know, that we do need something that like sort of very systematically guides exactly what sort of research should happen. So I don't actually know exactly how to make sense of that in non-ideal terms.
Question. David and Justin, increasingly a criteria in global ethics is sustainability. Would you discuss how you might apply that in the areas you're studying?
Thanks. So sustainability seems to be a goal of conservation biology insofar as you want populations that persist over time. But then the question is, you know, what are we willing to accept as like say a risk of extinction over the next 100 or 200 years? And ultimately, I think that's a normative matter. It's a question about what our values are and what kind of risks we're willing to accept. So I mean, sustainability, just in general, you know, is pretty vague. And so I think in conservation biology, it can be given very precise, a more or less precise kind of formulation in terms of persistence of some species, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and the stuff I was talking about, I'm not sure how relevant that is to exactly the argument that I was discussing, but certainly there's a big discussion about whether or not GM crops contribute to sustainability or not. So some people will argue that they do because they can reduce pesticide use and herbicide use and things like this. And at the same time, GM crops are generally planted in monocultures, which is not a particularly sustainable way to farm. So sustainability is definitely in the background of arguments pertaining to GM crops, but it doesn't necessarily come directly into the argument that I was giving. But, yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anyone?
Yeah, well, I want to sort of take up that idea because I think sustainability seems to be the sort of elephant in the room when it comes to talking about genetically modified crops. What's going on in India right now in rural parts of the north part of the country where genetically modified corn is failing to grow and farmers are committing suicide because of this. This really gets to the heart of the sustainability issue because it's not the case that technology is this sort of like savior of mankind that we tend to think it to be, right? It's often the case that technologies are used to sort of further this institutionalized, well, not necessarily institutionalized, but to further non-egalitarian ideals. I mean, this is not an egalitarian relationship.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess.
I mean, I don't really think that that's the elephant in the room. I mean, in my view, when it comes to GM crops, the elephant in the room is the way in which property rights function and the particular way in which intellectual property rights function here contributes to a concentration of power in the hands of the producers, right? I think that's, when it comes to just so health risks and environmental risks and things like that, I don't see a difference in kind between methods of producing GM crops and traditional methods, right? The big difference between the two is sort of quote-unquote socioeconomic risks that come from the particular way in which intellectual property rights function. That's my view on it. So I see that as the elephant in the room and not sustainability. But we could talk more about that later. But.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.